Imagine opening your front door every morning knowing the ocean outside sits higher than your roof. One weak wall, one failed pump, one powerful storm, and entire cities could disappear beneath the water. It sounds like the plot of a disaster movie, yet for nearly 18 million people, this is simply everyday life. Welcome to the Netherlands, a country where airports, highways, farms, and entire neighborhoods exist below sea level. By all logic, this place shouldn't exist. Most nations avoid building in areas the sea wants to reclaim. The Dutch did the exact opposite. They looked at the ocean and made an astonishing decision. They would push it back. For centuries, they have fought one of the most relentless enemies on Earth. Not with weapons, but with engineering, determination, and an extraordinary understanding of water. Every single day, millions of people trust their lives to a system that never gets a day off. If it stopped working, parts of the country could slowly return to the sea. So how does an entire nation stay dry when the ocean is literally higher than the land? The answer isn't just impressive. It's one of humanity's greatest engineering stories. And it begins more than 1,000 years ago. Long before modern cities covered the landscape, much of the Netherlands wasn't land at all. It was a vast mixture of marshes, rivers, swamps, and shallow coastal waters. The country sits where several of Europe's largest rivers flow into the North Sea, creating rich soil, but also making the region one of the easiest places in Europe to flood. Today, around a quarter of the Netherlands lies below mean sea level, while nearly 60% of the country is at risk of flooding if its water defenses were ever to fail. That means millions of people live in places where nature constantly tries to reclaim the land. Even Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, one of Europe's busiest airports, sits several meters below sea level. Every day, thousands of passengers land safely on ground that would naturally be underwater if engineers stopped controlling the water. So why would anyone build a nation here? Because despite the danger, the land offered enormous rewards. The fertile soil produced excellent crops. The rivers connected traders to the rest of Europe. Fishing brought food and wealth, and the coastline opened doors to international commerce. The sea threatened their survival, but it also created their future. The earliest communities quickly realized that surviving here meant working together. They built simple earthen banks around their villages to keep out everyday floods. At first, these barriers were small, built by hand using little more than soil, clay, and determination. They worked against ordinary tides, but powerful storms often destroyed them. When the walls failed, entire villages disappeared beneath the water. Homes were washed away, farmland vanished, and families were forced to begin again from nothing. But something remarkable happened. Instead of giving up and moving somewhere safer, the Dutch learned from every disaster. After each flood, they built stronger dikes. They dug canals to guide water away from settlements. They worked together because protecting one village meant protecting every village nearby. Over generations, those simple walls became massive flood defenses. They also discovered that if they surrounded an area with dikes and pumped the water out, they could actually create brand new land where the sea once existed. These reclaimed areas became known as polders, and they would eventually transform the country forever. At first, water was removed using simple methods, but later one invention changed everything: the windmill. Today, many people see Dutch windmills as beautiful symbols of the country. Few realize they were once life-saving machines. Their giant sails powered pumps that lifted water out of low-lying land and into canals, allowing farms, roads, and entire communities to remain dry. For centuries, thousands of windmills worked almost continuously, helping the Dutch claim more and more land from the sea. It was an extraordinary achievement, but there was one problem. No matter how advanced their system became, nature always had the final say. And in the winter of 1953, the sea reminded the entire country exactly how powerful it could be. On the night of January 31st, powerful winds pushed enormous waves toward the Dutch coastline, while unusually high tides raised the water even further. Hour after hour, the sea battered aging dikes that had protected communities for generations. For a while, the defenses held. Then the first breach appeared. Soon another followed. Then another. Before long, hundreds of breaks allowed freezing seawater to rush inland. Most families were asleep when the flooding began. They woke to icy water pouring into their homes. Roads disappeared beneath the waves. Entire neighborhoods became islands within hours, while rescue teams struggled to reach people trapped by powerful currents. As dawn arrived, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. More than 1,800 people had lost their lives in the Netherlands. Tens of thousands were forced from their homes. Farms that had fed generations were submerged, and communities faced unimaginable destruction. The tragedy shocked the world, but for the Dutch, it delivered a painful lesson. Repairing broken dikes would never be enough. If they truly wanted to survive, they needed to rethink everything they believed about controlling water. So instead of asking how to rebuild what had been destroyed, engineers asked a far bigger question. What if they could design a system so advanced that a disaster like this would become almost impossible? The answer would lead to one of the greatest engineering projects in human history. And what they built next still leaves experts around the world in awe. The plan that emerged after the 1953 disaster was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Dutch engineers knew they could no longer rely on simply making their dikes a little taller. The next storm could always be bigger. Instead, they decided to redesign the country's relationship with the sea itself. The result became known as the Delta Works, a massive network of dams, floodgates, locks, levees, and storm surge barriers stretching across the southwestern coast of the Netherlands. It took decades to build and cost billions of dollars, but many engineers still consider it one of the greatest civil engineering achievements ever completed. Some of these barriers are almost impossible to appreciate until you see their size. Steel gates weighing hundreds of tons stand ready to close whenever powerful storms threaten the coastline. Most of the time, they remain open, allowing ships to pass and nature to flow normally. But when sea levels begin rising to dangerous heights, the entire system comes to life. One of the most remarkable examples is the Maaseland Barrier near Rotterdam. Each of its giant floating gates is roughly the length of the Eiffel Tower lying on its side. During calm weather, they rest harmlessly beside the shipping channel, barely attracting attention. But when a severe storm approaches, computers monitor the water level every minute. If the sea rises beyond a critical point, the gates slowly swing shut, sealing off the waterway and protecting millions of people living inland. Watching the barrier close is like watching science fiction become reality. Yet for the Dutch, it is simply another layer of protection quietly waiting for the day it is needed. But giant barriers alone are not enough. Even on ordinary days, water is constantly trying to seep back into the country. Rain falls, rivers swell, groundwater rises. Without continuous management, reclaimed land would slowly fill with water again. That is where one of the Netherlands' most overlooked heroes comes in. The pump. Centuries ago, windmills performed this job. Today, thousands of powerful electric pumping stations work around the clock. They move enormous amounts of water from low-lying land into canals, rivers, and eventually back to the sea. Some pumps have been operating continuously for decades, with backup systems ready to take over if one ever fails. This means the battle against water never truly ends. It continues every hour of every day, even while most people are asleep. And behind every pump is an intricate network of canals that stretches across the country like veins through the human body. These waterways are carefully designed to collect excess rainwater, control river levels, and direct water exactly where engineers want it to go. Every canal has a purpose. Every lock serves a function. Every gate is part of a much larger system. Nothing is left to chance. Even more surprising is who manages it all. Long before the modern Dutch government existed, local communities formed organizations known as water boards. Their only responsibility was controlling water and maintaining flood defenses. Some of these institutions are more than 700 years old, making them among the oldest democratic organizations still operating anywhere in the world. Their job never stops. Teams inspect dikes every day, looking for tiny cracks, erosion, or weak spots that most people would never notice. Sensors buried inside flood defenses measure pressure, moisture, and movement deep below the surface. Satellites monitor changes in land elevation from space, while computer models predict how rivers and oceans will behave days before storms arrive. If even the smallest problem is detected, repairs begin immediately. That constant attention explains why the Dutch don't think about flood protection only after disasters happen. Prevention is built into everyday life. But despite all this incredible engineering, a new challenge has appeared, one that no previous generation had to face. The sea itself is changing. Scientists have observed that global sea levels are gradually rising as the climate warms. At the same time, parts of the Netherlands are slowly sinking because of natural ground subsidence and centuries of draining wetlands. It is a dangerous combination. In some places, the water is rising while the land beneath it is falling. That reality has forced Dutch engineers to think differently once again. Instead of trying to trap every river between higher and higher walls, they introduced a bold new idea known as room for the river. Rather than forcing water into narrow channels, they began giving rivers more space to spread safely during periods of heavy rainfall. Some floodplains were lowered. Certain dikes were moved farther back. New overflow areas were created so excess water could flow into open land instead of crowded cities. At first, the idea sounded backwards. Why would a country famous for keeping water out deliberately create places for water to enter? Because engineers realized something important. You cannot win every battle against nature by building bigger walls. Sometimes the smartest solution is to work with nature instead of fighting it. That single shift in thinking is now inspiring flood protection projects around the world. Yet perhaps the biggest surprise of all has nothing to do with dams, pumps, or billion-dollar engineering projects. It is the simple fact that every person living in the Netherlands plays a role in keeping the country above water. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The reason the Netherlands continues to succeed is not just because of world-class engineers or billion-dollar projects. It is because protecting the country has become part of its identity. Children learn about water management in school from an early age. Communities understand why flood defenses matter. Homeowners, businesses, farmers, and local governments all contribute through water taxes that help maintain the country's vast network of dikes, canals, pumps, and barriers. For the Dutch, flood protection isn't a project that ends. It is a responsibility that passes from one generation to the next. That mindset has created one of the safest flood management systems ever built. But many people still ask one question: what would happen if everything suddenly stopped? Imagine every pump shutting down at the same time. At first, nothing dramatic would happen. Cars would still drive through the streets. Trains would continue running. People would go to work without noticing anything unusual. But beneath the surface, the balance would begin to change. Rainwater would start collecting in the lowest areas. Groundwater would slowly rise. Canals would become fuller. Rivers would have fewer ways to release excess water, especially during periods of heavy rainfall. Days would turn into weeks, weeks into months. In many reclaimed areas, water would gradually begin returning to places where it had been removed decades or even centuries earlier. This wouldn't look like the giant waves often shown in disaster movies. Instead, it would be a slow but relentless process. Streets could become waterlogged. Farmland might disappear beneath shallow lakes. Homes built below sea level would face increasing pressure from rising groundwater. The danger becomes much greater during storms. Without functioning pumps and properly maintained barriers, a powerful North Sea storm could overwhelm weakened defenses, allowing seawater to rush inland once again. That is exactly why every critical part of the Dutch flood protection system has backups. Major pumping stations have emergency power supplies. Storm surge barriers are constantly tested. Engineers inspect flood defenses throughout the year, searching for even the smallest signs of weakness before they become serious problems. The goal is simple: never allow another disaster like 1953 to happen again. And so far, that commitment has worked. The Netherlands has become a global classroom for flood protection. Engineers, scientists, and government leaders from countries around the world regularly visit to study Dutch expertise. Nations facing rising seas, including parts of the United States, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom, have borrowed ideas inspired by the Dutch approach to water management. Yet the Dutch themselves know there is no finish line. Climate change continues to raise difficult questions. Sea levels are expected to keep rising over the coming decades. Extreme rainfall is becoming more common in many parts of Europe. Every new challenge demands new ideas, new technology, and continued investment. Instead of assuming yesterday's solutions will work forever, the Netherlands continues to adapt. Floating neighborhoods are being tested in some areas. New nature-based flood defenses are being developed. Dikes are strengthened long before they become unsafe. Computer models grow more accurate every year, helping engineers predict floods before they happen. This constant willingness to improve may be the country's greatest defense of all. When most people look at the Netherlands, they see peaceful canals, bicycles crossing charming bridges, colorful tulip fields, and historic windmills turning slowly in the breeze. What they don't see is the invisible battle taking place every single day. Thousands of pumps quietly moving water, engineers monitoring barriers around the clock, sensors hidden inside dikes, computer systems tracking tides, storms, and river levels every second. An entire nation working together to keep the sea exactly where it belongs. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this story. The Dutch never truly defeated the ocean. They simply learned how to live with it. Every sunrise brings another day in one of humanity's greatest engineering experiments. A country that, against all odds, continues to exist below sea level without disappearing beneath the waves. And maybe the biggest question isn't whether the Netherlands can survive the next 100 years. It's whether the rest of the world will need to learn the same lessons as sea levels continue to rise. If you lived in a country where the ocean stood higher than your home, would you trust walls, pumps, and engineering with your family's future? Or would you choose to leave before the next great storm arrived? Let us know what you would do in the comments.